What happens when someone walks onto a stage expecting admiration, but instead finds themselves standing inside a spotlight that feels more like an interrogation lamp? What happens when a late-night interview stops feeling like comedy, and starts feeling like a courtroom? And what happens when two people who are both experts at controlling a room suddenly realize only one of them actually owns the stage? That night, the studio lights were brighter than usual. Not because anything special had been planned, but because tension has a strange way of making every shadow sharper. The set of Gutfeld glowed in its familiar palette of electric blues and clean white highlights. The floor reflected the lights like polished glass. Cameras glided silently along their rails. The band wrapped up a fast, playful riff that bounced off the studio walls and dissolved into the ceiling. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal. But beneath the laughter warming up in the audience, something else was already forming. At the desk sat Greg Gutfeld, leaning back in his chair with that familiar expression that always seemed halfway between curiosity and mischief. His glasses rested low on his nose. A stack of cue cards lay loosely in his hand. He wasn't reading them. He was studying them, the way a chess player studies a board before making the first move. The red applause sign blinked above the audience. Instantly, the crowd responded. Clapping erupted in the practiced rhythm of a late-night taping, enthusiastic, automatic, perfectly timed. Greg glanced toward the camera and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice relaxed, teasing, almost playful, "tonight's guest has been an actress, a duchess, a documentary star, a cultural lightning rod, and according to several headlines this week, possibly the most misunderstood human being on planet Earth." The audience laughed. Not loudly. But enough. Greg tilted his head slightly. "Please welcome," he paused just long enough for the band to hit a short drum flourish. "Meghan Markle." The applause rose instantly. Stage curtains parted. And Meghan Markle stepped into the light. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years learning how cameras read posture. Her sleeveless ivory high-neck top caught the studio lights with a soft sheen. A brown suede skirt brushed just below the knee. Tall leather boots tapped softly against the glossy floor as she walked. Her hair was pulled into a tight, elegant low bun. Not a single strand out of place. Her chin lifted slightly as she waved once to the crowd, controlled, composed, perfectly measured. For a moment, everything looked exactly like a normal late-night entrance. Greg stood as she approached the desk. "Meghan," he said, extending his hand with a grin. "Welcome to chaos." She shook his hand quickly. Her grip was firm, but brief. "I'm sure I'll survive," she replied. A few laughs scattered through the audience. But the tone of her voice carried something faint beneath the politeness. Something cool. They both sat down. The applause faded. The studio settled into that quiet hum that only exists inside television tapings, the sound of lights buzzing faintly overhead, cameras adjusting focus, producers whispering behind glass. Greg glanced down at his cue cards and casually adjusted one. "So," he said lightly, "how does it feel to be the most analyzed woman on the internet, who never asked for attention, but somehow keeps finding it?" The audience laughed again. Not harshly. But noticeably louder than before. Meghan smiled. The expression was polished, practiced, almost effortless. But if someone had been watching closely enough, they might have noticed the subtle tightening along her jaw. "I think that says more about the internet than it does about me," she replied calmly. Greg nodded slowly. "That's a very diplomatic answer." "I try to stay above noise," she said. "Not inside it." Greg raised an eyebrow. Interesting place to say that, from a television studio. Laughter rippled across the room again. This time Meghan's smile thinned slightly. She crossed one leg over the other. "Visibility doesn't mean obsession," she replied. "True," Greg said. "But obsession does require visibility." For the briefest moment, the air between them shifted. Meghan exhaled softly through her nose, a sound halfway between amusement and restraint. "You're very confident in your assumptions." "I'm a talk show host," Greg replied with a shrug. "It's literally in the job description." The audience chuckled. Meghan gave a small nod. The kind of nod that suggested patience. Greg leaned forward slightly. "Let's keep it light for a moment," he said. "You've lived in Britain, Canada, America. If you had to pick one place that truly felt like home, where would it be?" Meghan didn't hesitate. "Home is where I'm respected." The audience murmured. Greg tilted his head. "So, not a geographical answer. It's a personal one." Greg smiled. "Personal answers are my favorite kind." He tapped his cue card once. They usually come with footnotes later. Laughter rolled through the studio. Meghan's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "You're enjoying this," she said. Greg shrugged. "I enjoy curiosity. It keeps the lights on." She glanced briefly toward the audience, then back at him. "Curiosity can also be invasive." "So can fame," Greg replied. "Yet here we both are." That line landed heavier than the others. The laughter faded faster this time. Greg flipped his cue card casually. "You've spoken a lot about reclaiming your voice since leaving royal life," he said. "Do you feel fully free now?" Meghan's smile returned. Polished again. Controlled. "I feel aligned with my truth." Greg nodded slowly. "That's very brand consistent." This time the audience reaction was louder. Some laughed harder than expected. A few even clapped. Meghan's eyes hardened. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. Greg shrugged. "Nothing negative." He leaned back in his chair. "Just that every public figure eventually becomes a brand. Some resist it, some accept it, some monetize it." Meghan leaned back slightly. "You say that as if it's immoral." "No," Greg replied calmly. "I say it as if it's honest." For a moment, silence settled over the studio. Meghan pressed her lips together briefly. "I don't see my life as content," she said. "I see it as purpose." Greg smiled faintly. Those two words live very close to each other in Hollywood. A few claps echoed. Meghan exhaled slowly. "I notice you reduce everything to jokes." Greg tilted his head. "And I notice you inflate everything into meaning." The audience reacted instantly. Laughter. Gasps. A few low murmurs. Meghan straightened in her chair. "Meaning," she said carefully, "is what separates humans from entertainers." Greg didn't flinch. "And yet entertainers are the ones people invite into their homes every night." The crowd laughed louder. But Meghan didn't. She studied him now. "You think this is a game?" Greg smiled. "I think this is a talk show." He folded his hands on the desk. "Games require two willing players." Her voice cooled. "I didn't come here to be trivialized." "And I didn't invite you to be canonized," Greg replied. The room went quiet. Not silent. But noticeably still. The kind of stillness that spreads when an audience suddenly realizes something subtle has shifted. Greg tapped his desk lightly. "All right," he said casually. "Let's talk about something you've chosen to share publicly." He glanced at his cue card again. "Your story. The interviews. The documentaries." He looked back at her. "Do you ever worry that constant retelling turns personal pain into performance?" A ripple moved through the audience. Meghan's jaw tightened. "Pain doesn't stop being real because it's described," she said. Greg nodded. "True." He paused. "But repetition does change how it's perceived." Meghan tilted her head slightly. You sound like you're accusing me of exaggeration. Greg shook his head slowly. I'm accusing the audience of fatigue. A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Meghan's eyes flashed. Fatigue is a luxury for people who weren't the ones harmed. Greg's expression didn't change. And certainty is a luxury for people who believe their version is the only one. The studio fell quiet again. Cameras adjusted. A producer shifted nervously near the stage curtain. Something had changed. The playful rhythm of the interview, the late-night comedy energy, the easy laughter. It was fading. Replacing it was something tighter. Something sharper. Meghan leaned forward slightly. You invited me here under the pretense of conversation, she said. Not cross-examination. Greg smiled faintly. And you arrived under the expectation of control. He tapped the desk once. We're both adjusting. The audience leaned forward almost collectively. The band had stopped moving entirely. Greg glanced at the next cue card, then looked up again. Don't worry, he said lightly. We're still in the friendly part. Meghan met his gaze. Her smile didn't return. So am I, she said. And for the first time that night. No one laughed. Because everyone in that studio could feel it. The smiles were already masks. The real confrontation hadn't even started yet. And when it did, this stage would stop feeling like a talk show. It would start feeling like a battlefield. What happens when the polite laughter of a late-night audience begins to falter, and the subtle hum of studio lights becomes the soundtrack to a silent standoff? The energy in the Gutfeld studio had shifted imperceptibly at first, a fraction of a second here, a slight pause there. But now, it was undeniable. The laughter had thinned. The polite applause cues felt hollow. The cameras hovered, sensing the change before the audience fully realized it themselves. Greg Gutfeld leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the wooden desk. The polished surface reflected the studio lights, casting a soft glow onto his face. His eyes, however, weren't looking at the audience, they were fixed on Meghan Markle, who sat across from him with arms crossed and a gaze sharp enough to cut through glass. Every subtle movement, every flicker of expression was amplified in the charged air between them. So far, Greg began, his voice smooth but deliberate, we've established that you're deeply meaningful, universally misunderstood, and very tired of being discussed. A true modern icon. A few polite laughs broke from the audience, scattered like leaves in a breeze. Meghan's expression remained neutral, her lips pressed together. I didn't say I was misunderstood, she replied, her tone low, measured. I said people choose not to understand. Greg nodded slowly. Intentional misunderstanding. Much darker. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes narrowing. Much more accurate. The silence that followed was tense, punctuated only by the faint whirring of cameras adjusting their focus. The lights above cast sharp shadows across the desk, highlighting every subtle micro-expression, every twitch of an eye, every slight tightening of a jaw. Greg shifted to a new card, casually flipping it over. Let's talk about the version of your life that millions actually watch. The one on screens, documentaries, interviews, speeches. Do you ever feel like you're trapped inside your own narrative loop? No, Meghan answered instantly. Her tone was crisp, cutting through the stillness. Because that's a lazy question. It assumes I lack self-awareness. Greg tilted his head, the faintest smirk curling at his lips. It assumes you repeat yourself a lot. Laughter erupted across the studio. This time it wasn't polite. It was sharp, immediate. Meghan's eyes hardened. People repeat themselves when the world refuses to listen, she shot back. Greg leaned back, fingers steepled on the desk. Or when the message benefits the speaker. A collective, "Oh," echoed through the crowd. The temperature in the studio rose by degrees, invisible but palpable. Micro-reactions spread across faces like wildfire, a split of agreement, shock, discomfort. "You're trying very hard to frame me as opportunistic," Meghan said, her voice deliberate. "It's transparent." "I'm trying very hard to understand the business model," Greg replied. "I'm curious." "My life is not a business model," she said, raising a finger. "Then Hollywood owes you a refund," Greg shot back lightly. The audience laughed again, some clapping at the quip. Meghan didn't react. "You're enjoying provoking me," she said, voice low now, the calm veneer thinning. "I enjoy dialogue," Greg replied, soft, steady. Provocation is a side effect when honesty shows up uninvited. Meghan inhaled sharply, her chest rising just enough to betray her control. Honesty without empathy is just cruelty in nicer packaging. Greg's eyes locked with hers, unflinching. Empathy without skepticism is a marketing campaign. A few scattered claps rose from the audience, quickly dying into murmurs of uncertainty. The studio lights seemed brighter now, colder, harsher, as if reflecting the mood. "You've spoken often about escaping a toxic system," Greg continued, voice smooth, measured. "Yet your public life since leaving has been almost entirely built around that very system. Do you see the irony?" Meghan's voice was cool, even, but each word cut. "You see irony. I see consequence." "For what?" Greg asked, leaning forward just slightly. "For survival," she said sharply. Greg studied her closely. "You're very skilled at turning critique into threat." She smiled without warmth. "And you're very skilled at turning trauma into content." The audience reacted audibly. Gasps intertwined with low murmurs. The hum of tension became almost visible. Camera operators stiffened. Every flash of light seemed to etch the intensity into the studio floor. Greg lifted his hands slightly, palms open, as if to emphasize calm neutrality. "I didn't bring it here." "You did." "I brought my truth," Meghan said, leaning forward, eyes flashing. "You turned it into entertainment." "And yet," Greg said evenly, "you agreed to appear on a late-night comedy show. That suggests at least partial comfort with entertainment." "There's a difference between telling a story and being mocked for it," she said, her voice taut. Greg shrugged. "Mockery tends to happen when people feel lectured." The crowd murmured again. Meghan's jaw clenched visibly. "You reduce everything to audience reaction," she said. "As if meaning depends on applause." Greg smiled faintly. "On this stage, it absolutely does." Her stare was sharp, unyielding. "Then we are very different kinds of people." Greg nodded slowly. No argument there. The silence between them thickened. Even the air conditioning seemed to hesitate, the studio almost holding its breath. Greg tapped another cue card lightly. "All right, let's talk about power. You've criticized institutions, hierarchy, control. Yet many would say your influence now rivals the very thing you left behind." Meghan scoffed softly. "Influence earned is not the same as authority inherited." "True," Greg replied evenly. "But influence without accountability can look suspiciously similar." Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. "You keep circling that word." "Because it keeps circling you," he said calmly. The audience reacted again, louder this time. Laughter, applause, and low gasps intertwined in a chaotic pattern. Meghan's irritation was no longer subtle. "You're obsessed with accountability," she said. "It's almost moral theater for you." Greg spread his hands. "Everything on this stage is theater. The question is, who's pretending not to know it?" Meghan straightened slowly, shoulders stiff. "You think I don't know the mechanics of this world?" "I think you know them very well," Greg replied. "That's the problem." A low rumble passed through the audience. Tension had escalated beyond polite curiosity. Every person in the studio now felt the weight of the room's shift. Greg pressed on, measured. You left royal life to escape control, yet your new life is built entirely on controlling the narrative. Do you ever feel trapped by that contradiction? Meghan laughed once, sharp, quick. You frame contradiction as weakness. I frame it as evolution. Evolution usually produces something new, he said, calm. I hear mostly the same story with better lighting, she snapped. That drew the strongest audience reaction yet. Laughter, gasps, even audible whispers. The atmosphere was electric, taut as a wire about to snap. You're very comfortable judging from a desk, Meghan said. Let's see how philosophical you are when your entire identity becomes a global punching bag. Greg's smile faded fractionally. It already is. I just don't call it persecution. Meghan's stare intensified. You enjoy minimizing what I've experienced. I enjoy questioning what you claim, Greg replied, quiet, precise. She leaned forward now, voice sharp, almost steel. And I'm telling you, you're out of your depth. The room went silent. Not quiet, but still. Heavy. Almost unbearable. Greg remained calm. Depth isn't measured by outrage, he said. It's measured by how well scrutiny is tolerated. Meghan straightened. Then you should try being scrutinized by the entire world, for existing. Greg nodded once. You're right. I only host a show watched by millions every night. Practically anonymity. Laughter erupted, sharper than before. Half of it nervously forced, half of it genuine. Meghan did not laugh. Her lips pressed thin. You think this is clever, she asked. I think it's honest, he replied. She shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. You trivialize something that reshaped my life. And you dramatize something that reshaped your career, Greg said evenly. The audience reacted instantly. Half were murmuring in approval, half in disbelief. The tension was no longer just between the two of them, it had spread, infecting everyone in the room. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a collision. Meghan exhaled sharply, frustration barely contained. You think you're exposing something tonight? You're only exposing your obsession with controlling a woman you can't dominate with jokes. The studio erupted. Some cheered in agreement. Others gasped in shock. Greg's smile vanished. No, he said firmly. What I'm exposing is how quickly empowerment turns into contempt, when it's challenged. Meghan rose, chair scraping sharply against the floor. The sound cut through the studio like a knife. You invited me here to ambush me, she snapped. To ridicule, to provoke, to humiliate. Greg rose as well, calm, steady. I invited you here for a conversation, he said. You turned it into a battlefield. You thrive on tearing people apart, she said. That's your currency. And you thrive on lecturing people who no longer applaud, he countered. The audience exploded. Shouts, applause, gasps, protests, a chaotic, human storm in a controlled studio. Producers ran to the edges of the stage, signaling frantically. Cameras wobbled, trying to hold the shot. The energy had become almost too heavy to bear. Meghan pointed at him, eyes flashing. You think this is your victory? Greg shook his head slowly. No. This is the moment the show stops being a debate, and starts becoming a spectacle. He turned slightly toward the camera. And I won't run a spectacle based on personal contempt and hostility. Meghan laughed bitterly. So that's it, she said. You preach free speech, then shut it down when it turns on you. Greg's voice stayed calm, measured, final. I shut it down when it turns into disrespect. This program cannot continue like this, and you cannot remain on this stage under these conditions. The studio froze. The audience split, murmurs echoing. Meghan's face registered disbelief. You're asking me to leave? Greg nodded once. Yes. I am. And in that moment, the room collectively understood, this interview would end, but no one would forget what they had just witnessed. The stage, once a place of polite late-night comedy, had become a battlefield. And the fallout was only just beginning. What happens when the tension in a room becomes so thick that you could cut it with a knife, and everyone knows that the next moment could decide everything? The Gutfeld studio felt smaller now. The lights, still bright and clinical, reflected off every polished surface, exaggerating shadows. Cameras hovered, capturing every flicker of emotion. The audience, once warm with polite applause and nervous laughter, had grown rigid, unsure where to look, unsure how to react. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, waiting for the inevitable spark. Meghan Markle stood near the edge of the desk. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, posture defensive, yet radiating a kind of power that made it impossible to look away. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, locked onto Greg Gutfeld, who had not moved from his position behind the desk. Every gesture he made was deliberate, calm, unyielding, yet underneath it all was a tension that mirrored the audience's collective heartbeat. "You invited me here to ambush me," Meghan said, her voice tight, low, controlled but threaded with fury. "To ridicule, provoke, humiliate." Greg's expression didn't waver. "I invited you here for a conversation," he said. "You turned it into a battlefield. You thrive on tearing people apart," she shot back. "That's your currency. And you thrive on lecturing people who no longer applaud," he countered. A deafening silence followed. The audience was caught between awe and shock, some leaning forward, others frozen mid-clap. The studio lights seemed almost alive, bathing the confrontation in stark, unforgiving brilliance. The band had stopped playing entirely, instruments idle. Producers gestured urgently, but no one dared intervene, the tension had become its own director. "You think this is your victory?" Meghan snapped, pointing directly at him, eyes blazing. Greg shook his head slowly. "No. This is the moment the show stops being a debate and starts becoming a spectacle." She laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the walls, sharp and hollow. "So that's it? You preach free speech, then shut it down when it turns on you." Greg's voice remained measured, final. "I shut it down when it turns into disrespect. This program cannot continue like this, and you cannot remain on this stage under these conditions." The studio froze. Murmurs spread through the audience like a wave. The energy had reached a tipping point. Cameras trembled slightly as operators readjusted, capturing every micro-expression, every flicker of raw emotion. "You're asking me to leave?" Meghan said, disbelief in her voice. "Yes," Greg replied simply. Meghan's lips pressed into a tight line. Her gaze swept the room, catching the stunned faces of the audience. Some gasped. Others cheered quietly, the reaction fractured, chaotic. She moved with deliberate control, picking up her jacket from the chair in one fluid motion. "Enjoy your tiny kingdom," she said, voice cold, sharp, cutting. "It runs on mockery and small minds." Greg did not flinch. His eyes held hers steadily. "And yet, it still runs on accountability," he replied calmly. Meghan turned toward the audience, her expression fierce. "Remember this moment," she said, voice echoing through the silent studio. "This is what happens when you refuse to perform." And with that, she walked off the stage, boots clicking sharply against the floor. The curtains closed behind her with heavy finality, cutting the studio in two. A collective breath seemed to release in that instant, relief, shock, and awe mingled in the same pulse. Greg remained standing behind the desk, chest rising slowly and deliberately. The cameras lingered, capturing his calm, controlled presence. His eyes scanned the audience briefly, then back to the lens. "Well," he said quietly, voice almost conversational despite the chaos that had just unfolded, that escalated exactly the way it needed to. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. People clapped hesitantly, uncertain if the sound was for courage, relief, or acknowledgement of the storm they had just witnessed. "We'll be right back," he continued, tone steady, almost detached. "If everyone can manage to stay civil for 90 seconds. The music hit the studio, low and tense, carrying a strange mix of triumph and unease. The screen faded to black for a moment, leaving viewers suspended in the raw, unfiltered energy of what had just transpired. The aftermath was already beginning to echo beyond the studio walls. Social media erupted. Clips spread like wildfire. Analysts dissected every glance, every pause, every word. Opinions collided. Headlines formed and vanished with the speed of an uncontrolled wildfire. Some applauded Meghan's composure, her unwillingness to be reduced to spectacle. Others lauded Greg's unwavering adherence to boundaries and accountability. And in the center of it all, the room that had contained the confrontation felt almost sacred in its intensity. Every camera had captured the silent exchanges, the micro-gestures, the subtle shifts in power. Every audience member had felt the invisible weight of history being written in real time, in live color, under the unflinching lights of late-night television. What had started as a routine interview had become a demonstration, a study in human dynamics, power, perception, and morality. Two people, both highly skilled in the art of performance and persuasion, had collided, and neither had emerged unscathed. Yet neither had truly lost. The stakes had been too high for victory or defeat. This was about survival, boundaries, and the unflinching courage to stand in one's own truth. As the credits began to roll over the subdued studio, Greg leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed and facilitated something rare. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the most honest moments aren't the ones filled with applause. They're the ones where respect, integrity, and courage meet tension head-on. And tonight, we all witnessed that." A slow beat passed. Cameras pulled back, the lights dimmed slightly, and the screen faded to black. The final shot lingered, almost cinematic in its precision, leaving viewers suspended in the echo of what had just occurred. If this confrontation left you stunned, there are more moments like this waiting to be explored. Moments where dialogue teeters on the edge of spectacle. Moments where the truth is sharper than applause. Like the video if the intensity held you hostage. Comment below, whose side are you on? Meghan's defiance, or Greg's insistence on boundaries? Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next explosive face-off. And share this video, let your friends experience what it's like when a late-night stage becomes the arena for raw human tension. Because sometimes, the performance ends, but the story doesn't.